Step in closer, and let's slip quietly into a world both distant and hauntingly familiar. It's the 19th century. Fog coils in the alleys. Horse-drawn carriages rattle past crumbling brick buildings. And, in a cold, dimly lit schoolroom, a teacher is already awake, scribbling lesson plans by candlelight, their breath visible in the icy morning air. The room is silent, save for the soft scratch of chalk and the occasional groan of wooden beams settling with age. The day hasn't begun, but already. The teacher is tired. In Victorian Britain, education was hailed as a force for progress, a noble endeavour, a civilizing mission. But behind the heavy oak doors of the classroom, the reality was far more brutal. Endless hours, punishing expectations, moral scrutiny, students arriving half-starved from child labour. Female teachers are forbidden to marry, male teachers barely scrape by. Classrooms overflowing, diseases spreading, and inspectors always watching. It wasn't just a job, it was a performance, a prison, and, for many, a quiet descent into madness. So come with me, let's dim the lights, turn the pages, and open the lesson book on a time when the classroom was more punishment than promise. This is why being a Victorian teacher was a nightmare. The schoolroom of shadows, a glimpse inside. Soft, echoing footsteps on creaking wood. A distant clock ticks. The sun is still low, hidden behind fog that clings to the rooftops. The schoolhouse is cold, colder inside than the street outside. You open the door. The hinges groan. You're the first one here. The fire hasn't been lit. Your breath fogs in the still air as you cross the cracked stone floor. You light the coals, sweep the chalk dust, wipe the slates, fill the inkwells. 2 hours until the students arrive. The Victorian classroom is stark, plain, and cruel by design. Rows of wooden benches, a towering blackboard, bare walls stained with soot, no colour, no softness. The desks are narrow, the rules narrower. 50 students, maybe more, will cram inside before the bell. Some are hungry, some coughing, all expected to obey. Discipline hangs in the air like smoke, a dunce stool in the corner. The punishment cane hanging behind your desk. Even your tools, dry chalk, clotted ink fight against you. The curriculum is rigid. Inspectors can appear without warning. A single missed register entry or a child's stumble in recitation can cost you your job. This room isn't built for curiosity. It's built for control, and this is only the beginning. Miserable pay. Maximum pressure. Imagine standing in front of 50 restless children. You've been up since dawn, preparing the room and reviewing the government-mandated curriculum. 6 hours of teaching stretch ahead without help, without rest. For this, you're paid less than a stable boy. Male teachers in cities might earn £80 to £100 per year before paying rent and buying supplies. Rural teachers earned far less, sometimes under 30. Some worked only for room and board. Women earned even less. Respectable employment options were few, and teaching was one of them, but marriage meant instant dismissal. And the job drained more than time and energy, it drained your purse. You bought your own chalk, your own slates, even food for hungry pupils, so they wouldn't faint at their desks. Then came 1862's revised code. For now, you know only this: your pay is no longer guaranteed. From here on, the size of your wage will depend on how well your students perform when the inspector comes. One wrong sum, one faltered reading, one mark of disorder, and your salary is cut. You start to drill the class harder. There's no time for art or music, no room for joy, just repetition, recitation, regurgitation, until your voice cracks and your spirit frays. The payment by results tyranny. In 1862, the government decided that education should be measured and paid for like a business transaction. The revised code tied school funding and teacher pay directly to the results of a single annual exam in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Pass, and the money flowed. Fail, and it stopped. Inspectors arrived without warning. A stiff-collared man would take a seat at the back of the room, notebook in hand, and watch. Children, some as young as 6, were called up one by one to prove themselves. The teacher's future hung on every trembling answer. A shaky cue, a forgotten sum, could mean a smaller paycheck. It didn't matter if the child was sick, if supplies had run out, or if the river flooded the road to school. The result was a system obsessed with rote learning. Teachers became drill sergeants. Students became reciting machines. Understanding didn't matter only the performance. Some headmasters cheated, keeping weaker pupils home on exam day, or focusing all attention on the best children. Others kept students late into the evening, drilling them until their hands were raw from millwork and writing practice. For many teachers, the job became a moral battle. Follow instincts and teach with compassion, or survive by working the system. Creativity withered. Curiosity died. Every lesson became a ledger entry. Every child, a number. And those numbers, in turn, were chains binding an entire profession in place. Even the inspectors, in private moments, admitted the system stifled real learning. But it persisted because it looked efficient on paper, and because the people enforcing it never had to live under it. It didn't just underpay teachers. It robbed them of joy, agency, and the very reason they entered the classroom in the first place. Rote learning and mental drudgery. The Victorian classroom was a factory for memory, not understanding. From the moment the bell rang, children were drilled in endless recitations, multiplication tables, spelling lists, grammar rules, and long passages of the Bible. Words were spoken aloud in unison, a monotone chorus designed less to inspire thought than to hammer facts into young minds. Teachers paced the rows with a watchful eye, ready to strike the desk or the child if the rhythm faltered. Rote learning was the backbone of the education system because it was measurable. An inspector could hear a class recite perfectly and mark it a success without caring whether any child understood what they'd said. This meant every subject was reduced to a performance. History was a string of dates, geography, a list of capitals, arithmetic, a sequence of sums completed without explanation. Creative thought was a risk there was no time for questions, and any deviation from the lesson plan was seen as a weakness in discipline. For the teacher, it was an exhausting form of survival. Their own livelihood depended on producing perfectly drilled pupils. So they spent long nights preparing rigid timetables and copying out model sentences. The cane sat ready, not always from cruelty, but because order was the only thing keeping the day from collapsing into chaos. Even a gifted teacher with a love of learning found themselves reduced to a kind of warden, keeping time, measuring volume, and ensuring the lines in a copybook were perfectly straight. The result was a strange quiet, a room full of children speaking in unison, yet no true conversation. Bright pupils grew restless, their curiosity dulled by repetition. Struggling ones were punished into silence. The system's purpose was never to nurture individuality, it was to create obedient, moral citizens who could read, write, and follow orders. In time, both pupils and teachers became weary actors in the same mechanical play, each recitation another turn of the crank in the great machine of Victorian education. The ever-present inspector. The inspector could arrive at any time. One moment, a teacher might be midway through a spelling lesson. The next, the door creaked open, and in stepped a man in a dark coat with a ledger in hand. His gaze swept the room like a searchlight, pausing on crooked handwriting, frayed uniforms, or a fidgeting child. Conversation froze. Even the air seemed to grow colder. These inspections were more than mere visits. They were judgments with teeth. Funding for a school could be cut if test scores dipped or moral discipline appeared lax. A teacher's career could end with a single poor report. And so, when inspectors were present, the classroom became a theatre. Lessons were rehearsed in advance, pupils warned to sit perfectly straight, answers drilled into their minds until they could be spat out without hesitation. Inspectors did not simply measure academics, they assessed moral instruction. Was the Bible taught daily? Were the pupils well-mannered, their speech free from slang or insolence? Did they show deference to authority? These were not suggestions. They were the pillars of what the government saw as proper British character. Even sympathetic inspectors upheld the system, because to do otherwise was to undermine the very purpose of state-sponsored education. For teachers, the real terror was not being caught doing something wrong, but being found wanting in something they had no control over. A child could faint from hunger in the middle of an inspection. A slate could break. A lesson could unravel when a nervous pupil forgot their lines. All could be marked against the teacher. And so, the constant awareness of this invisible threat of the man who might walk through the door tomorrow hung over every lesson like a shadow. The children who endured it all. Most children in working-class districts arrived at school already tired. Some had been up since dawn sweeping streets, working in textile mills, or minding younger siblings while their parents laboured. They shuffled into classrooms in worn boots, thin jackets, and patched trousers, their fingers red and stiff from the cold. Hunger gnawed at them, but there was no breakfast, waiting only a day of recitations, copywork, and discipline. The rooms themselves were often harsh. In winter, frost coated the inside of the windows, and the only heat came from a single iron stove that smoked and coughed more than it warmed. Benches were hard and narrow, forcing children to sit upright for hours. Slates were shared between 2 or 3 pupils, and ink was a luxury. Illness spread quickly. Measles, influenza, whooping cough, and attendance was mandatory unless death itself intervened. Discipline was as relentless as the lessons. Lateness brought public scolding, sometimes the cane. A missed answer could mean writing lines until one's hand is cramped. Talking out of turn or questioning the teacher's authority was met with swift punishment. Teachers often enforced these rules not out of cruelty, but because their own position demanded order above all else. In a system where chaos meant failure, kindness could feel like a risk. And yet, in the cracks of this rigid system, there were flickers of resilience. A child secretly practicing their letters at home by candlelight, another lingering after class to see the pictures in a geography book. For some, education, no matter how cold or punishing, offered a glimmer of escape from the grinding poverty outside. But for most, it was simply another kind of labour, endured until the day they were old enough to leave and work full-time. In Victorian Britain, the classroom did not always promise a better life. It only promised that life would be harder if you failed to endure it. Cramped rooms and crumbling walls. If the teachers were exhausted and the children were starving, the school buildings themselves were not far behind. Victorian schoolhouses were rarely designed with comfort or even basic hygiene in mind. They existed to serve a purpose. Pack in as many children as cheaply as possible. As a result, many became overcrowded, cold, and dangerously unsanitary. The layout was almost always the same. Long rows of benches or desks faced a single blackboard, with no space for movement or collaboration. Classrooms in poorer districts often crammed in 70 or more pupils under the supervision of one teacher, with no assistants. In the most overcrowded rooms, children had to stand between desks or kneel on the floor just to take notes. Some schools lacked electricity, relying on tall windows for light. But grime, cracks, and broken panes often left rooms dim, even on clear days. On overcast afternoons, lessons were taught in near darkness, forcing children to squint at their slates while teachers strained to see their faces. In winter, the cold was biting. In summer, the air grew heavy and suffocating. Ventilation was almost non-existent. With 60 or more bodies in one room, the stench of damp clothing, coal smoke, and unwashed children lingered thick in the air. Illness spread quickly. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and ringworm were common classroom visitors. With few toilets and scarce soap, hygiene was a constant battle that most schools lost. Some school privies served dozens of children and staff, and they were rarely cleaned. There were no hygiene inspections, and leaking roofs or flooded floors didn't stop lessons from continuing. In rural areas, buildings were often little more than crumbling shells, roof tiles missing, door frames rotting, and floors so thin you could hear rats beneath. Weather added its own trials. Teachers sometimes had to move pupils to avoid puddles forming indoors during heavy rain. A diary from one Lancashire teacher described a snowstorm blowing in through a broken window. She gave her shawl to a freezing boy in the front row and continued teaching with blue hands. There was no such thing as a snow day. Heating, when it existed, came from open coal stoves or fireplaces. In theory, they provided warmth, but in reality, they filled the air with smoke and ash. Children seated too close risked burns, while those at the back shivered through lessons. Some teachers rotated seating to give everyone a chance near the fire. Others simply told pupils to endure it. The conditions wore down teachers as much as their pupils. They breathed the same stale air, marked homework by candlelight, and caught illnesses from their students. With no sick leave or substitutes, they taught until they physically couldn't, and if the teacher collapsed, lessons often stopped entirely. To the government, these buildings were symbols of progress. They had bell towers, stone facades, and iron gates that looked impressive from the street. Inside, they often lacked insulation, books, or even safe flooring. The respectable appearance masked a reality of drafty rooms and crumbling walls. Victorian schools were meant to elevate the poor, yet their decaying structures reflected the very neglect they were supposed to address. Behind those brick exteriors were cold, echoing rooms where both teacher and child battled discomfort every day. And when frustration built up in such conditions, discipline often turned harsh. In the next chapter, we'll step inside that darker side, where control was enforced not through respect, but through pain, the reign of the cane. In a world where overcrowded classrooms tested the patience of even the most dedicated teacher, discipline became the weapon of choice. The Victorian belief was simple. Obedience could be beaten into a child, and learning would follow. Teachers were expected to maintain order at all costs, and the cane became both a symbol and tool of their authority. Fear was not a byproduct of education, it was its foundation. The range of punishments was vast, and often brutal. The cane delivered quick, stinging strikes to palms or knuckles, but it was far from the only weapon in a teacher's arsenal. Leather straps, rulers, and even wooden pointers found their way across children's backs and legs. In some schools, misbehavior meant kneeling for hours on bare floorboards, holding heavy books until arms shook with pain. Offences were often trivial. A dropped pencil, a wrong answer, or a moment's glance out the window could trigger punishment. In an era when silence and stillness were equated with learning, even a whisper could be seen as defiance. Teachers, under pressure to produce perfect discipline for school inspectors, ruled with a hair-trigger sense of authority. Some methods of discipline carried a public shaming element. Boys might be forced to wear the dunce cap, a tall paper cone meant to mark them as slow or foolish. Girls could be paraded before the class for minor missteps, their cheeks burning with humiliation. The point wasn't just to correct the offender, it was to make an example of them, so others wouldn't dare follow. There was no legal safeguard for the child. Parents often supported the teacher's right to punish, believing that strict discipline built character. Complaints about excessive force rarely reached authorities, and when they did, they were usually dismissed. The teacher's word outweighed the student's, and bruises were considered proof of good correction. Religious morality played a heavy hand in this culture of punishment. Many believed misbehavior was a sign of moral weakness, even sinfulness. Scripture was quoted to justify the rod, and some teachers framed their authority as divinely appointed. Disobedience, therefore, wasn't just breaking school rules, it was defying God's order. Punishments could leave physical marks that lasted for days, but the psychological scars were harder to see. Children learned to suppress curiosity, speak only when spoken to, and hide mistakes rather than risk attention. Creativity and self-expression were often the first casualties, replaced with a rigid fear of doing the wrong thing. Some teachers took pride in their severity, boasting about how quickly they could silence a class. Others, weary and underpaid, saw strict discipline as their only tool to survive the chaos of an overcrowded room. The few who resisted this culture often struggled to maintain control and were criticized as weak or ineffective. The atmosphere this created was one of constant tension. Students sat with straight backs, hands folded, and eyes forward, not out of engagement, but to avoid drawing notice. The sound of footsteps approaching could make a child's stomach drop, especially if the teacher's cane tapped against the desk in time with each step. Still, not all punishment was physical. Detention meant staying late to copy lines until fingers cramped. Some children were denied recess, forced to watch others play while standing in the cold. Others were assigned extra chores, scrubbing floors, cleaning chalkboards, or carrying coal tasks, meant to reinforce both obedience and their place in the school's hierarchy. In such an environment, education was as much about endurance as it was about knowledge. Children learned to calculate risks, when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to avoid the teacher's eye. Survival meant blending in, mastering the art of invisibility within the rigid order of the classroom. But beyond discipline lay another pillar of Victorian education: religion. It shaped lessons, moral codes, and even the punishments themselves. In the next chapter, we'll open the school's Bible and see how faith was woven into every page, every lecture, and every breath of the Victorian schoolroom. Lessons in faith. For Victorian children, the schoolroom was not only a place for arithmetic and spelling, it was a chapel in miniature. Religion seeped into every corner of the day, from the morning hymn to the final prayer before dismissal. The Bible was not merely a text for Sunday, it was the moral compass by which all learning was measured. To be educated was to be moulded into a Christian subject, obedient both to God and to authority. The day often began with scripture reading. Students stood at their desks, reciting verses in unison under the watchful eye of the teacher. The cadence of their voices filled the cold air, each syllable an act of duty rather than devotion. Understanding the words mattered far less than delivering them without error or hesitation. Religious instruction was not confined to a single subject, it bled into every lesson. Arithmetic might be used to calculate the dimensions of Noah's Ark. Geography lessons framed in terms of missionary work abroad. History focused on kings and queens as instruments of divine will. And science, when taught at all, was presented as evidence of God's creation. For some children, this constant infusion of scripture brought comfort. The familiar rhythms of hymns and psalms gave structure to their day, a steady pulse in an otherwise harsh environment. For others, it felt suffocating, a reminder that even in their education, there was no space to think freely or question the world around them. The teacher, often viewed as a moral guardian, carried the weight of spiritual responsibility. Their role extended beyond academic instruction. They were expected to shape the souls of their pupils. Any sign of irreverence, a smirk during prayer, a stumble in recitation was treated as a moral failing, not just a breach of discipline. Religious societies and charitable organizations often funded these schools, and their influence was unmistakable. Walls bore scripture plaques, and battered hymnals sat stacked in corners, their pages soft from years of use. Missionary collections were common, with students encouraged to donate pennies they could scarcely afford, as a demonstration of both charity and obedience. For female teachers, the moral scrutiny was even sharper. They were held as examples of virtue, expected to embody the ideals they taught: modest, pious, and self-sacrificing. Marriage was often forbidden, under the belief that a wife's devotion to her husband would distract from her devotion to her pupils. In this way, faith shaped not only the students' lives, but the teachers' fates as well. Religious education also reinforced the rigid social order of Victorian Britain. The poor were taught that their station in life was divinely appointed, and that hard work and obedience were the truest forms of worship. Questioning one's place in society was not encouraged; it was seen as questioning God's plan. Examinations sometimes included moral questions alongside academic ones. A child might be asked not only to solve an equation, but also to explain a biblical parable. Failure to provide the correct interpretation could be marked as an error, as surely as a misspelled word. This blurred line between moral and intellectual testing kept children constantly aware that both their minds and souls were under judgment. Yet, for all its constraints, religious instruction gave some children their first exposure to literacy. Reading the Bible was, for many, the first sustained practice they had with written language. In this way, faith opened a door to knowledge, even if it kept a firm hand on what could be found beyond it. By the time the final prayer was said and the children were dismissed, faith had been as much a part of the day as ink and chalk. It shaped how they saw the world and how the world saw them. But as the century wore on, cracks began to appear in this union of church and classroom, as new ideas about education started to challenge the old order. Barely trained, always blamed. You might imagine that someone entrusted with shaping the minds and discipline of dozens of children would be highly trained. Years of study, guided mentorship, a deep understanding of pedagogy and psychology. But in the Victorian classroom, many teachers had little more than a basic education themselves. Even those who received formal instruction were often given only the bare minimum, then expected to succeed under crushing expectations. Some came from scholarly or clerical backgrounds. Others were simply literate workers promoted to teaching because they could read and write. A weaver's son might teach arithmetic simply because he had finished Standard 6. For women, especially unmarried ones, the path could be even shorter, just a few months' preparation before being placed in charge of a full class. The title of trained teacher often meant less than it suggested. One common route into teaching was the pupil-teacher system. At 13 or 14, a promising student would be chosen as an apprentice. They taught younger children during the day and received their own lessons before and after school. For 5 years they juggled teaching, studying, and grading, while barely older than the pupils they instructed. The demands were relentless. Many pupil teachers collapsed under exhaustion, their youth mistaken for resilience. Even those who persevered struggled to command authority over students nearly their own age. And for those without family connections or money, advancement was far from guaranteed. Teacher training colleges existed, but their quality varied wildly. Some focused heavily on religious doctrine and moral instruction. Others offered little more than rote lectures on set curricula. Few touched on child psychology, special needs, or creative teaching methods, skills desperately needed in overcrowded, impoverished classrooms. There was no standardized teaching certificate for much of the Victorian era. Requirements shifted constantly, and oversight was weak. Some teachers faked credentials, while desperate school boards hired anyone who could fill a post. Once inside the classroom, there was no safety net, just the expectation to succeed without complaint. If students failed their exams, the teacher bore the blame. If discipline faltered, it was proof of a weak hand. Successes were attributed to the school system. Failures were personal indictment. The weight of the classroom's fate rested entirely on one pair of shoulders. Imagine being 18, never having left your hometown, and suddenly standing before 60 restless children. You have no assistant, no training in managing such numbers, and no real authority beyond your voice. One wrong, move a misspelled word on a slate, a whisper during dictation, and you could be dismissed overnight. Female teachers faced additional obstacles. They were paid less than men, given larger classes, and expected to be paragons of morality and patience. Marriage meant instant resignation. The belief was that a wife belonged at home. Careers could vanish with a single proposal. When school performance dropped, when illness swept through, or when parents complained it was the teacher who took the fall, the system itself was never questioned. In 1871, a young schoolmistress was reprimanded for lacking the energy to manage her scholars. She was 16 years old and responsible for 83 pupils. Victorian teachers were not just underprepared. They were trapped in a system that demanded everything while giving almost nothing. Undersupported, overburdened, and often still children themselves, they were held to standards that even seasoned educators would have found impossible to meet. The inspector is coming. In Victorian Britain, no phrase could unsettle a teacher's nerves more than, "The inspector is coming." Those words were whispered in staff rooms and passed between pupils as if announcing the arrival of royalty, and, in a way, they were. An inspector's visit wasn't just an observation, it was a trial. Careers could be advanced or destroyed in a single afternoon. School inspections became widespread in the mid-19th century, when government funding for education increased. The Committee of Council on Education dispatched inspectors to ensure this investment was well spent. On paper, the goal was to improve quality. In practice, it often meant judging teachers by rigid criteria that ignored the realities of their classrooms. One of the most feared policies was payment by results. A teacher's income depended directly on how well their pupils performed in the inspector's exams. Every incorrect answer meant money lost not just for the school, but for the teacher's own wages. It transformed learning from a gradual process into a high-stakes performance. Preparation for an inspection was an exhausting ritual. Teachers spent late nights drilling pupils, polishing floors, and rehearsing questions they thought might come up. The best-behaved children were moved to the front, while the more troublesome or less prepared were quietly told to stay quiet during the visit. The classroom became a stage, and the teacher its nervous actor. Inspectors examined everything with a meticulous eye. Was the handwriting neat? Were the sums correct? Did the pupils stand when addressed? Even the condition of the desks and the cleanliness of the blackboard could make it into the final report. It was a judgment on the teacher's control as much as on the children's knowledge. Some inspectors were notorious for their cruelty. One story tells of an inspector who interrupted a grammar lesson with deliberate mistakes, waiting to see if the teacher corrected him. Another flipped a child's slate upside down mid-problem to test composure. These were not acts of guidance, they were traps. The stress was relentless. Teachers described sleepless nights, nausea, and in some cases fainting before the inspector even arrived. A poor report could mean public humiliation in the local press, loss of income, or dismissal. There were no appeals. An inspector's word was final. The most heartbreaking accounts came from teachers working in impossible conditions. One London schoolmistress wrote of teaching 78 children in a single room and being penalised for not introducing music lessons. "I wept that night," she confessed in a letter, knowing I could do no more. The inspector's report didn't mention the overcrowding or the lack of instruments, only the failure. To survive, some teachers learned to manipulate the system. They focused on preparing only the pupils most likely to impress. Subjects not covered by the exam were neglected, no matter how valuable they might be for the children's lives. Creativity, curiosity, and experimentation were luxuries the inspection regime could not afford. Yet not all inspectors were cruel or indifferent. Some quietly acknowledged the hardships and offered encouraging words. But the official system rewarded marks and metrics, not empathy. Even the most compassionate inspector was bound to the same checklists, the same unforgiving formulas. For many Victorian teachers, the inspector was not simply a visitor. He was a looming shadow in their daily work, shaping lessons, punishing mistakes, and draining joy from the classroom. Teaching became less about educating minds and more about surviving the next evaluation. In that world, every school day felt like a rehearsal for judgment, starving for supplies. Modern classrooms might overflow with books, posters, and technology. The Victorian classroom, by contrast, often had less than a cupboard's worth of teaching tools. Many teachers worked with cracked slates, splintered desks, and a single battered textbook if they were lucky. The lack of resources wasn't an occasional frustration, it was a daily obstacle. Supplies were considered luxuries, not essentials. Paper was expensive and often reserved for inspections or special occasions. Most children brought nothing with them except their own hands and voices. Teachers had to improvise endlessly just to keep lessons going. Slates were the primary writing tool, cheap, reusable, and endlessly fragile. Many were chipped or worn smooth from years of use. Pupils shared them, taking turns to complete exercises, which slowed lessons and spread illness. To erase mistakes, children often used spit and rags, a method as unsanitary as it was common. Textbooks were scarce and rarely up to date. A school might have one geography book for dozens of pupils, forcing the teacher to read passages aloud while children listened and memorized. Science was often skipped entirely in working-class schools, not because it wasn't valued, but because there were no materials to teach it. In rural areas, even basic maps were decades out of date. Resourceful teachers found ways to adapt. Some cut up old newspapers for reading practice. Others made counting tools from matchsticks or buttons. Ink could be brewed from soot, water, and a drop of vinegar. These acts of ingenuity kept lessons alive, but devoured the teacher's time and energy, adding hours to an already exhausting day. Physical conditions compounded the problem. Many classrooms had broken windows, no heating, and leaky roofs. In winter, children shivered in their coats, and in summer they sweltered under a haze of dust. Desks were bolted into rows, making movement and group work impossible. A teacher could not rearrange the room, even if they wanted to. In wealthier schools, often church-run or located in prosperous towns, resources were better. They might have globes, wall maps, or a set of hymnals. But for most teachers, especially in industrial districts, the classroom was little more than a drafty shed with a blackboard. Even the blackboard might be so worn that chalk barely showed. Complaints about shortages rarely led to improvements. Teachers who raised concerns were dismissed as ungrateful or incompetent. If the inspector found lessons inadequate, the blame fell on the teacher, not the lack of materials. One woman in Manchester was scolded for poor arithmetic results in a class of 90 with only 2 books and 4 pencils. This scarcity shaped how children learned. Without paper for notes or drawings, lessons relied heavily on repetition and oral recitation. Memorization replaced exploration. In such a setting, the teacher's skill wasn't just in delivering lessons, it was in wringing usefulness from whatever scraps they had. To teach in a Victorian classroom was to be part instructor, part craftsman, part survivalist. Every object, be it a chipped slate, a torn map, or a stub of chalk, was precious. And yet, day after day, teachers stepped into their bare rooms, faced the expectant eyes of dozens of children, and somehow, against all odds, found a way to begin. A day in the life, hour by hour. By mid-morning, the classroom had already descended into chaos. Children shuffled, whispered, and occasionally shrieked, their bare feet slapping against the wooden floorboards, echoing through the cold, cavernous room. The teacher moved from desk to desk, correcting errors in arithmetic and reading aloud from cracked, ink-stained books. Each moment demanded precision. A misstep could spark murmurs of complaint or a sharp rebuke from those overseeing the school. The lesson plans blurred together, hours slipping past like water through fingers. Every hour brought new challenges: a child who refused to cooperate, a spill that ruined ink on papers, a dispute between students that needed instant arbitration. The teacher's voice became hoarse from repeating the same instructions, each word carrying the weight of expectation and exhaustion. Yet, despite the chaos, there were fleeting moments of triumph when a student finally understood a difficult lesson, or when a whispered joke brought a brief smile to the tense faces. By afternoon, energy waned across the room. The children's movement slowed, and attention flickered like a candle struggling against wind. The teacher, muscles stiff and joints aching, continued to enforce order, balancing discipline with fleeting encouragement. Meals were rushed, cold, barely enough to restore stamina, yet every second of rest had to be sacrificed for lesson preparation and grading. Evening crept in, and the relentless day showed no mercy. Reports had to be written, letters sent to parents, and registers completed, all while keeping an eye on the restless students. The teacher's back ached, fingers trembled from fatigue, and the cold had sunk deep into every bone. Still, they persevered, understanding that another day would demand the same, if not more, and that endurance was no longer optional, it was survival. The weight of exhaustion. Exhaustion was not just physical, it had a way of seeping into every thought, every decision. The teacher's mind raced as they tried to maintain composure, correct mistakes, and inspire students simultaneously. Even the simplest instructions required effort, and patience, once abundant, now thinned dangerously. Yet the students did not pause for sympathy. They demanded attention, understanding, and immediate response to their every whim. Every lapse, however small, carried consequences. Inspectors could arrive at any moment, and the fear of their scrutiny never fully lifted. Small mistakes were magnified into larger failures, each one a reminder of the system's strict expectations. By evening, mental fatigue overshadowed the physical, a suffocating weight that pressed on the mind and heart alike. The relentless pace left no room for reflection, for rest, or for error. Even during meals, thoughts drifted back to unfinished tasks, corrections pending, and lessons yet to be taught. Sleep offered only temporary relief, as the next day's responsibilities loomed large, waiting to test endurance and resolve once again. Every day was a test, every hour a challenge. And yet the teacher pressed on, bound by duty, habit, and an unspoken sense of necessity. Systemic strain. The exhaustion of one teacher mirrored the struggles faced by many across town. Inspectors arrived without warning, meticulously checking registers, questioning students, and noting absences. Mistakes, however minor, could be punished swiftly, leaving teachers wary of every movement and decision. The system demanded near-perfect efficiency, resilience, and endurance, often at the cost of personal well-being. Yet, even amid oppression, small victories existed. A lesson well received, a moment of laughter, or a breakthrough in comprehension provided glimmers of relief. These moments, though fleeting, were a teacher's sustenance, reminders that effort was not entirely futile. Still, the pressure was relentless, and burnout was common. Many abandoned classrooms, leaving gaps that were difficult to fill. Survival required cunning as much as stamina. Teachers developed strategies, silent signals with students, pre-planned routines, and careful rationing of energy. Each day became a balancing act, navigating between maintaining discipline and preserving mental strength. Adaptability was essential. The system did not forgive weakness, yet those who endured often discovered hidden reservoirs of resilience. The ones who endured. Endurance was less about heroism and more about strategy. Teachers learned to pick battles wisely, conserving energy for the moments that truly mattered. Humor and small acts of kindness became shields against the harsh realities of the classroom, fleeting moments that maintained both sanity and morale. They discovered subtle ways to protect themselves from constant scrutiny while still fulfilling every duty expected of them. Community support played a crucial role. Stories of past struggles, shared advice, and simple camaraderie offered guidance and reassurance. Teachers observed one another, learning techniques to cope, anticipating difficulties, and quietly sharing survival strategies. Over time, they built resilience not through brute force, but through clever adaptation, emotional intelligence, and careful navigation of social hierarchies. By mastering these subtle strategies, teachers survived where others faltered. Their endurance was a quiet triumph, a testament to human adaptability under relentless pressure. In the face of an unforgiving system, they became invisible survivors, carrying on not out of choice but necessity, and discovering in that survival a strange, muted pride that few outside the school walls could understand. The children they taught. Victorian teachers worked under impossible pressure, yet they were never truly alone. The classroom was shared with the very souls they were expected to shape, the children. Some arrived hungry, their stomachs growling from a night without food. Others were wild and restless, their energy spilling into every corner. Many were terrified, caught in a system that valued obedience far more than understanding. Most pupils came from poor families. Their hands were grimy, boots threadbare, and coats patched or worn through, offering little protection against winter's chill. Some had barely eaten since the night before, while others arrived directly from factory floors, fingers blackened with coal and eyes rimmed in soot. Teachers didn't just manage classrooms, they managed trauma, fatigue, and hunger all at once. Classrooms were overcrowded, often crammed with 80, even 100 children in a single room. Desks were placed tightly side by side, with boys and girls seated separately, sitting stiff-backed and barely able to move. In winter, children wrapped their cold feet in scraps of newspaper, while in summer the air grew thick with the stench of unwashed bodies. Noise, heat, coughing, and unrest were constants, leaving teachers clinging to every ounce of patience. Instruction was mechanical and repetitive. Children were drilled in reading aloud, arithmetic tables, and copying moral slogans in perfect copperplate. There was little room for creativity or curiosity, and a single misstep could reflect poorly on the teacher. Punishment was never far behind. Children could be beaten, boxed on the ears, made to stand for hours, or publicly shamed in front of their peers. Yet not all children were broken. Some found fleeting moments of joy or peace within the rigid system. A teacher might slip a crust of bread into a lunch tin, whisper words of encouragement, or read aloud from a storybook that had no place in the curriculum. These rare gestures became unforgettable, forming a fragile bridge between compassion and cruelty. Children sometimes resisted. They hid chalk, sang rude rhymes behind the teacher's back, or ran through windows when inspectors arrived. Older boys occasionally threatened female teachers, testing the limits of authority. The classroom was as much a battle for survival as it was a place of learning, and teachers quickly learned that discipline alone was not always enough. Some educators grew bitter, viewing their students as ungrateful or violent, while others burned with sympathy that could never be openly expressed. Kindness was often considered weakness, while silence, obedience, and test scores were rewarded above all. Despite the system's harshness, letters from former pupils decades later recall moments of warmth, the smell of ink, the gentle guidance of a caring hand, or the quiet comfort of an early lit fire. For all the suffering, some teachers left lasting impressions, not because they were strict or efficient, but because they dared to be human. The children were both the reason for their exhaustion and the fragile anchor that made their labor bearable. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, compassion could persist, quietly resisting the cruelty that surrounded them. The beginning of reform. Victorian education was a cage, yet even cages rust over time. By the final decades of the 19th century, small cracks began to appear in the rigid system. Reform arrived slowly, with no grand revolution or mercy, but it brought whispers of change for overworked, underpaid, and exhausted teachers. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established school boards, allowing local authorities to build and manage schools. Attendance was not yet mandatory, but state involvement marked the beginning of structured education. For teachers, this meant slightly more organization and oversight, a small reprieve in an otherwise relentless system. Progress was subtle but significant, signaling that the era of unchecked exploitation might be easing. Compulsory attendance for children aged 5 to 10 was introduced in 1880, followed by free education in 1891. More children entering the system created both opportunity and strain. Class sizes swelled, resources remained limited, yet public interest grew. Slowly, awareness of student and teacher needs began to emerge, and the oppressive payment by results system, tying salaries to pupil performance, was abolished in 1890. Teachers were finally allowed to teach, not just drill. Teacher training also improved. Normal schools expanded, formalizing certification and granting educators a faint sense of professionalism. The pupil-teacher system, where 13-year-olds managed classrooms while studying for exams, was phased out in favor of structured training courses. Though still exhausting, these reforms gave teachers the tools to push back against the notion that they were mere babysitters with rulers. Reform wasn't only bureaucratic, it was cultural. Newspapers began highlighting overworked teachers. Inspectors considered engagement alongside recitation. And the idea of teachers as moral guides rather than drill sergeants slowly gained traction. Female teachers, who formed a large portion of the workforce, organized into groups like the National Union of Women Teachers, advocating for equal pay, the right to marry, and professional respect. Their victories were incremental but planted seeds that would blossom in the next century. Change did not erase hardship. Schools remained underfunded, inspectors continued to watch, and poverty, especially in rural areas, slowed meaningful progress. Yet the worst aspects of Victorian education, the cruelty, chaos, and isolation, began to loosen their grip. In quiet corners of Britain's classrooms, the future of teaching stirred, laying the foundation for modern education. Teachers endured decades of systemic pressure, but reform hinted at a new possibility, that education could be more than punishment and rote memorization. These early changes set a precedent for valuing both students and teachers, planting the fragile seeds of humanity in an otherwise rigid system. The nightmare was far from over, but hope had quietly entered the room. The desks are gone, the chalkboards erased, and the coal fires long since burned out. Yet the ghosts of Victorian teachers linger not in the supernatural sense, but in the structures and practices they endured and shaped. Every modern classroom owes a debt to their labour, resilience, and courage. Compulsory schooling, literacy for the poor, and trained professionals guiding students were not gifts. They were earned through long hours, exhaustion, and forgotten lives. Many teachers, particularly women, died in poverty. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories almost entirely lost. Attendance logs, punishment books, and neat copperplate handwriting are the only surviving traces of their efforts. And sometimes it is that silence that speaks the loudest, echoing through modern classrooms still grappling with pressure, oversight, and systemic stress. If you've ever felt a teacher exhausted not by students but by a system, you've glimpsed the echoes of 19th century classrooms. Every lesson taught by candlelight, in cold and crowded rooms, was an act of quiet defiance. Some were cruel, some kind, but all lived through something brutal and left behind something necessary. Tonight, spare a thought for the teacher in 1875, waking at 4 a.m., her fire unlit, ink frozen, stomach empty, yet stepping into the cold to guide the next generation. Their endurance, suffering, and quiet triumph continue to shape education today. History never forgets its classrooms, even if the world sometimes does.